She lived without a voice to survive, until the Lord uncovered her secret. Isolde Vance is the high-born daughter of a traitor, the only one who saw the red wax seal on a scroll that condemned her family. To escape the High Inquisitor's reach, she flees to the coldest corners of the north, assuming the role of a mute scullery maid at Thornhall. For 3 years, her silence has been her sanctuary, hiding her aristocratic accent and sharp intellect from the world. But her master is Lord Alaric Thorne, the king's bloodhound, a man whose life is dedicated to uncovering secrets. When Alaric begins to suspect his broken bird is actually a high-stakes fugitive, Isolde must play a deadly game of cat and mouse, knowing that one slip of the tongue will lead her to the gallows. Before we deep into the story, please let me know in the comment where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you, and I don't want you to miss it anything. Now, let's get into the story. The world believed a woman's voice was her social currency. For Isolde, it was a death warrant. She knelt on the freezing stone floor of the scullery, her hands submerged in water, so cold it felt like needles. Her knuckles were raw, stained red from the lye soap and the relentless scrubbing. The kitchen smelled of damp soot, old grease, and the iron-scented air of the northern moors. She had not uttered a syllable in 3 years. In that silence, she had found a strange, hollow safety. It was an armor she had forged in the fire of the night her father died. She had once been the pearl of the Vance estate, educated in law and languages, her father's secret pride. But then came the scroll, the treasonous pact, and the High Inquisitor's arrival. She remembered the smell of expensive tobacco and the cold, predatory way the Inquisitor had looked at her when he realized she had seen the document. "A pretty witness is a dangerous thing," he had whispered, his hand catching her jaw. She had run that night, not with a suitcase, but with the clothes on her back and the terror of a hunted animal, selling her mother's ring for a passage to the edge of the world. At Thornhall, she was invisible. A broken bird, they called her. No one looked at a mute maid, until today. The heavy oak doors of the study creaked open, and the bloodhound himself entered. Lord Alaric Thorne didn't walk. He prowled. He was a man carved from the very granite of the north, his eyes sharp enough to cut through any ruse. He ignored the butler, ignored the head housekeeper, and stopped directly in front of Isolde. He pointed a gloved finger at the shattered mirror on the wall, then at the scroll sitting on his desk. This maid, Alaric said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, the one who never speaks. Why does she have the hands of a lady and the eyes of a scholar? Isolde's blood ran cold. She didn't flinch, but her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was being pulled into a new cage, and this time, the man holding the key was the only one capable of smelling the truth on her breath. The heavy oak doors of the kitchens groaned, signaling the arrival of the master. Isolde kept her head bowed, her gaze fixed on the steam rising from the copper vats of lye. For 3 years, the kitchen had been her world, a domain of gray ash, the sharp scent of rendered fat, and the rhythmic thrum of silence. She was merely a shadow in the corner of Thornhall, a ghost who moved at the soft, practiced footsteps of the invisible. To the other servants, she was simply the girl with the ruined throat. To the world, she was dead. The clatter of iron pots ceased instantly as Lord Alaric Thorne stepped onto the damp stones. He was a man carved from the jagged cliffs of the north, smelling of cold rain and expensive leather. They called him the king's bloodhound, for he possessed a terrifying instinct for the scent of a lie. Isolde's knuckles turned white as she gripped the rough wooden handle of her scrub brush. She felt the weight of his presence like a physical pressure against her spine. The girl, Alaric's voice cut through the humid air, a low, resonant baritone that made the water in the vat seem to tremble. The one who never speaks. Bring her to the center. The head housekeeper gave Isolde a sharp nudge. She stepped forward, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She did not look up, but she could feel his eyes, sharp, cold, and impossibly observant, tracing the line of her jaw and the curve of her hands. These were not the hands of scullery maid. Despite the raw, red skin and the broken nails, the bones were too fine, the fingers too long. She forced herself to hunch her shoulders, to mimic the posture of a woman broken by labor. "Look at me," he commanded. Isolde lifted her chin, meeting a gaze that felt like a blade. In the dim light, she saw him point toward the shattered mirror hanging near the servants' entrance, a jagged reflection of the room's fractured peace. Beside it, on a small side table, lay a scroll bound in red silk. Its presence as jarring as a splash of blood on snow. "I have spent my life hunting those who hide behind masks, girl," Alaric whispered, stepping so close she could feel the heat radiating from his cloak. "You move with the grace of a courtier and watch with the stillness of a predator. Silence is a clever shield, but it cannot hide the way you look at a royal seal." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate silkiness. "Who are you, broken bird? And what did you see that stole your voice?" Isolde remained a statue of stone. She swallowed the scream of her own name, keeping her secret locked behind teeth that ached from pressure. The Hun had finally reached his own halls, and the bloodhound had found his prey. The following morning, the atmosphere in Thorn Hall felt thick with unspoken accusations. Isolde scrubbed the soot from the study's hearth, her movements robotic and small. She kept her back to Lord Alaric, who sat behind his massive mahogany desk. The scratch of his quill the only sound in the room. The cracked mirror in the corner caught the morning light, casting fractured beams across the floor, a constant reminder of the shattered life she was trying so desperately to outrun. She could feel his gaze on the back of her neck, a steady, heavy weight that made the hair on her arms stand on end. The silence was broken by a sharp knock. A messenger entered, his boots caked in the gray slush of the moors, and handed Alaric a dispatch sealed with familiar, terrifying crest. Isolde's breath hitched, but she did not stop her rhythmic scrubbing. "News from the capital," the messenger announced, his voice echoing in the stone room. "The High Inquisitor has moved his forces north. They say he is searching for a shadow, a girl who vanished 3 years ago with a secret that could hang a dozen lords." The brush in Isolde's hand slipped, clattering against the iron grate. It was a minuscule sound, but in the sudden stillness of the room, it felt like a thunderclap. Her pulse hammered against her throat, the throat that was supposed to be dead, the throat that carried the accent of a lady and the scream of a witness. She forced her fingers to remain still, staring into black soot as if it could swallow her whole. "A shadow," Alaric repeated, his voice dangerously smooth as he dismissed the messenger. He rose from his chair, his shadow stretching long across the hearth until it enveloped her. "Strange, isn't it, how the mention of a hunter makes the quietest prey tremble?" He moved with the grace of a wolf, circling until he stood directly in front of her. He reached out, his gloved hand catching her chin and forcing her to look up into the fractured glass of the mirror. In the reflection, she saw herself, a girl in a stained apron, her face smudged with ash, but her eyes bright with sharp, aristocratic terror she couldn't suppress. "You did react like a maid hearing gossip of a distant official," Alaric whispered, his thumb brushing the line of her jaw. "You reacted like a woman who knows the exact weight of the Inquisitor's hand." Isolde's jaw tightened, her silence now a physical wall between them. She wanted to pull away, but his grip was as firm as it was curious. He wasn't looking for a servant anymore. He was looking for the truth hidden behind the cracks in her mask. The dust motes danced in the shafts of afternoon light that pierced the high, arched windows of the library, but the air remained heavy with the scent of old parchment and beeswax. Isolde moved through the aisles with a feather duster, her touch light, her presence reduced to the soft rustle of her wool skirts. She was acutely aware of Lord Alaric's absence, or rather, the calculated theater of it. He had left the room minutes ago, leaving his heavy oak desk cluttered with maps and correspondence, a deliberate invitation to a curious mind. Her eyes, despite her best efforts to keep them fixed on the floorboards, were drawn to a sprawling legal scroll spread across the center of the desk. It was an intricate land deed, written in the cramped, archaic script of the king's own clerks. As she passed the polished nearby globe, a single line of text leaped out at her, a glaring error in the Latin translation of a property clause that would, if left uncorrected, forfeit a third of the Thorn lineage's northern holdings to the crown. It was a masterpiece of a trap, a lure designed specifically for a woman whose education was far beyond her station. Isolde felt a cold sweat break across her palms. She knew she should keep moving, that a simple scullery maid should see only ink and squiggles where she saw catastrophe. But the scholar her father had raised chafed against the silence of her current life. She lingered, her duster hovering over a shelf of Greek tragedies, her mind racing through the legal precedents that could fix the flaw. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed the edge of a quill pen Alaric had left wet with ink. The silence of the room was absolute, yet it felt as though the very walls were leaning in to watch her. She looked at the scroll, then at the door. One stroke of the pen would save the estate, but would also sign her death warrant by proving she was no simpleton. Slowly, she withdrew her hand, tucking it into the fold of her apron, but she couldn't help the way her eyes traced the error one last time with a look of profound, intellectual frustration. It's a clumsy mistake, isn't it? Alaric's voice didn't come from the door, but from the shadows of the gallery above. His soul froze. He descended the spiral staircase, his boots clicking with predatory precision. He walked to the desk and stared at the spot she had been eyeing. "Most people see a pattern of black marks," he whispered, his eyes locking onto hers with terrifying clarity. "But you looked at that clause with the soul of a jurist. You didn't just see ink. Isolde. You saw the trap." He picked up the quill and held it out to her, the dark ink glistening like a threat. "Fix it. Show me the woman who hides behind that wall of stone, and perhaps I will show you why the bloodhound doesn't always bite." The sky over Thornhall turned the color of a bruised plum as a carriage bearing the obsidian seal of the crown rattled into the courtyard. Isolde stood in the shadows of the servants' entrance, her breath hitching as the door opened to reveal a man wrapped in furs the color of dried blood. It was him. The High Inquisitor, Silas Vane, had not changed in 3 years. He still carried that same air of sanctimonious cruelty, his eyes scanning the estate as if looking for a stray thread to pull until the whole world unraveled. Inside the great hall, the fire roared, yet the air remained frigid. Isolde's hand shook as she balanced a silver tray laden with wine and roasted meats. She felt Alaric's gaze, heavy and warning, fixed on her from across the room. He sat opposite the Inquisitor, his expression a mask of bored aristocracy that had the coiled tension of a predator. "The North is a cold place for a hunt, Silas," Alaric remarked, his voice smooth as silk over a blade. "The scent is fresh, Alaric," the Inquisitor replied, his voice a dry rasp that sent a jolt of ice through Isolde's veins. "The Vance girl is here. Somewhere. She carries a secret that belongs to the king, and I am not a man known for his patience." Isolde stepped forward to fill his glass. Every instinct screamed at her to turn and run, to vanish back into the moors, but she was trapped in the theater of her own making. As she poured the dark, heavy wine, the Inquisitor leaned back, his hand brushing against her apron. Isolde didn't flinch, but her pulse was a frantic drumming in her ears. She focused on a single point on the table, her face a blank slate of servant-like apathy. "A quiet house you keep," Vane mused, his eyes dropping to her trembling fingers. He reached out, his cold, bearing hand hovering inches from her wrist. "This one, she has a peculiar stillness about her. Does she speak?" "She is a mute, Silas. A broken thing from a village," Alaric intercepted, his tone dismissive, though his eyes never left the Inquisitor's face. "She is of no use to a man who hunts with his ears." The Inquisitor leaned closer to Isolde, the scent of expensive tobacco and old parchment clinging to him. He stared directly into her eyes, searching for a flicker of the girl who had witnessed his treason. Isolde held his gaze with a hollow, empty stare, her silence a fortress. She was no longer a lady. She was a ghost serving her executioner. For a heart-stopping moment, Vane lingered, his suspicion of palpable heat, before he gave a slow, predatory smile and reached for his glass. The hunt was no longer at the gates. It was sitting at the table, and Isolde was the one pouring the wine. The night air in the corridors of Thornhall was a frigid draught that smelled of dying embers and damp stone. Isolde moved through the darkness like a shadow, her bare feet silent against the cold floor. She was supposed to be in the servants' quarters, but the sight of the High Inquisitor's men patrolling the grounds had stirred a restless dread in her chest. As she passed the heavy velvet drapes of the library, the low, conspiratorial murmur of voices stopped her heart. She pressed herself into the alcove, her breath shallow and silent. Through the slight gap in the door, She saw the silhouette of Silas Vane, his profile sharp and vulture-like against the dying firelight. He wasn't alone. He stood with his captain of the guard, their heads bowed over a map of his state. Alaric is becoming a nuisance. Vane's voice drifted out, stripped of its public veneer and replaced with a terrifying, flat coldness. He asks too many questions about the Vance girl's father. He's a bloodhound who started digging in the wrong garden. If he discovers the pact I made with Vance before the man was silenced, the king will have my head. The captain shifted, the metal of his scabbard clinking softly. The moors are dangerous this time of year, my lord. A riding accident on the cliffs, or perhaps a tragic fire in the study. Make it look like the work of the Norse rebels, Vane commanded, his hand tracing a jagged line over the map of Thornhall. Tonight, while he sleeps, we cannot risk him finding the second scroll. Once Alaric is gone, we raise the servants' quarters. If the girl is here, she'll either burn or be flushed out into our hands. Isolde's blood turned to ice. She had spent 3 years perfecting the art of being nothing, of staying hidden to ensure her own survival. If she fled now into the blackness of the moors, she could disappear before the first torch was lit. She owed Lord Alaric nothing. He was her captor, a man who viewed her as a puzzle to be solved and a fugitive to be caught. Yet, as she looked toward the stairs leading to Alaric's private chambers, she felt the crushing weight of the truth she had carried for so long. To stay silent was to survive, but it was also to become an accomplice to the same shadow that had destroyed her father. Her safety was a hollow shield if it was bought with the blood of a man who, despite his stern duty, had offered her a strange, unspoken respect. The silence she had forged as armor now felt like a shroud. She had to choose, remain a ghost and watch the world burn, or find her voice and face the fire. Isolde moved toward the master's chambers, her heart a frantic prisoner against her ribs. Before she could raise a trembling hand and knock, the heavy door swung inward. Lord Alaric stood there, his coat discarded and his white linen shirt unbuttoned at the collar, looking less like a lord and more like a man haunted by his own shadows. He didn't seem surprised to see her. Instead, he stepped aside, gesturing her into the amber glow of the hearth. On the table sat a small, oval frame she hadn't seen in years. Isolde's breath hitched as she looked down at the miniature painting. It was a portrait of a young girl with hair like spun silk and eyes that had not yet learned to fear the world. It was Lady Isolde Vance, the daughter of a duke, captured in a moment of pure, sunlit innocence. The contrast between the girl in the gold frame and the ash-smudged woman standing in the room was a violent, silent scream. "I found it among your father's seize effects," Alaric said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to fill the small space between them. He picked up the portrait, his thumb tracing the painted line of her jaw. The High Inquisitor thinks he is hunting a ghost. He doesn't realize that the ghost has been pouring his wine and tending my fire for months. Isolde looked up at him, her eyes wide and wet with the tears she refused to let fall. She waited for the sound of iron shackles, for the call to the guards, for the end of her long, silent flight. But Alaric only set the portrait down with a gentle click. "I am the king's bloodhound, Isolde. My duty is to the law, and the law says you are a traitor's blood." He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming the scent of the wood smoke. But the law does not account for the look in a woman's eyes when she sees a murderer sitting at her table. I saw your hand shake tonight. I saw the way you looked at Vane. He reached out, his fingers brushing the hair away from her forehead in a gesture that was dangerously close to mercy. I should hand you over. It would be the simplest path. But I find I have no taste for delivering lambs to wolves. You have stayed silent to survive, but Vane is planning a silence of me that is far more permanent. He looked at her with a piercing intensity, searching for the woman beneath the maid's apron. "I will not arrest you tonight. I will give you a choice. You can run into the moors and pray the cold takes you before his men do. Or you can finally use the voice you've been hiding to tell me exactly what was written on that red silk scroll. Your silence saved your life once, Isolde. Now only the truth can save mine." The midnight air was a jagged blade of ice as Isolde slipped through the servant's passage, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had shed her heavy clogs, moving in woolen stockings that muffled her footsteps against the frozen mud of the courtyard. In the distance, The silhouette of the High Inquisitor's carriage loomed like a black sarcophagus, guarded by a lone sentry, whose breath bloomed in the air like ghostly plumes. She waited for the moon to slide behind a veil of heavy clouds before she crept toward the vehicle, her pulse a deafening roar in the silence of the north. The carriage door creaked with a sound that felt like a scream to her sensitive ears, but the sentry remained still, distracted by the flickering torches of the main gate. Isolde scrambled inside, the interior smelling of Vane's oppressive tobacco and old, cold parchment. Her fingers scrambled through the leather satchels, her touch frantic as she searched for the weight of the secret that had destroyed her life. Finally, tucked beneath a false floor in a mahogany dispatch box, she felt it, the smooth, cool texture of the red silk scroll. The seal was unbroken, a crimson stain of wax that held the evidence of the Inquisitor's treasonous pact. As she tucked the scroll into the bodice of her dress, the heat of the parchment against her skin felt like a brand, a heavy burden that could finally clear the Vance name or ignite a civil war. "A sharp who goes there," echoed across the yard. Isolde didn't wait to look back. She dived from the carriage just as the sentry's lantern swung toward the dark wheels. She scrambled beneath the undercarriage, her face pressed into the freezing slush, holding her breath until her lungs burned. The guard grumbled, kicking the carriage wheel once before retreating toward the warmth of the stables. Isolde bolted, her feet numb as she tore across the open stone toward the safety of the manor's back shadows. She wasn't just a mute maid anymore. She was a thief in the night, carrying the fire of the truth in her hands. She fled toward Alaric's private chambers, the red silk pressing against her heart, the only thing standing between the Bloodhound's death and the Inquisitor's ultimate triumph. The morning sun broke over the moors like a pale, accusing eye, but inside the great hall, the warmth of the hearth had been replaced by a suffocating tension. Silas Vane stood by the tall windows, his black traveling cloak billowing as he turned to face Lord Alaric. The High Inquisitor's face was a mask of livid fury, his hand resting on the hilt of a ceremonial dagger. He had discovered the theft of the scroll, and the predatory suspicion he had harbored since his arrival had finally sharpened into a deadly certainty. "You have played a dangerous game, Alaric," Vane hissed, the sound echoing against the high stone arches. "I know she is here, the girl who served my wine, the mute with the eyes of a scholar. She is no simpleton. She is the daughter of a traitor, and you have harbored her beneath your own roof." Isolde stood in the shadows of the gallery, the red silk scroll a heavy, burning weight against her ribs. She watched Alaric as he stood his ground, his silhouette tall and unyielding against the Inquisitor's accusations. The moment of reckoning had arrived. By the laws of the king, Alaric was bound to deliver her to the crown. To refuse was to invite his own execution for treason. "The girl is a servant of this house, Silas," Alaric replied, his voice a low, steady rumble that betrayed nothing. "If you wish to arrest a member of my staff, you will do so with a royal warrant, not with the frantic ramblings of a man who cannot keep track of his own dispatches. I need no warrant for the blood of a Vance." Vane roared, signaling his guards. The soldiers stepped forward, their armor clanking in the hollow space. "Hand her over, or I will burn this hall to the ground and find her in ashes. You are the king's bloodhound, Alaric. Will you throw away your honor, your title, and your life for a broken bird who cannot even scream for your mercy?" Alaric's hand moved to the hilt of his own sword, his eyes flickering toward the shadows where Isolde hid. In that look, she saw the terrible cost of his protection. He was choosing her, a fugitive, a ghost, over the very law he had spent his life defending. The shield of her silence had finally shattered, and the shards were cutting into the only man who had dared to see her. Isolde stepped out from the darkness, her hand reaching for the red silk at her bodice. She could no longer let him pay the price for a truth she alone carried. The heavy oak doors of the high court groaned on their hinges, a sound that usually signaled the beginning of another day of judicial posturing. But today, the silence that followed was different. It was brittle. Isolde stood in the center of the hall, the weight of 1,000 days pressing against her ribs. For 3 years, she had carried the secrets of the realm behind a wall of silence, her tongue a prisoner to a vow that many had mistaken for madness or frailty. The court was packed. The king's advisers leaned forward like vultures, their eyes searching her face for the usual compliance. the usual quietude that had allowed their corruption to fester in the shadows of her muteness. She looked up at the dais, meeting the Chancellor's gaze. He smiled a thin, oily expression of triumph, believing her inability to testify would finally seal the kingdom's ruin and his own ascension. Isolde felt the heat rising in her throat, the friction of words long dormant scraping against her soul. The air in the room seemed to thicken as she took a single step forward. She did not reach for her slate or her charcoal. Instead, she drew a breath so deep it seemed to pull the very light from the windows. Then the world shifted. "The seal is broken," she said. Her voice was not the frail whisper they expected, but clear, resonant toll that echoed off the vaulted ceiling like a cathedral bell. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Men stumbled back, and the Chancellor's smile vanished, replaced by the pale mask of the damned. The sound of her own voice felt alien to her, a vibration that shook her bones, yet it carried the authority of every injustice she had witnessed while the world thought she was not listening. She did not stop to let them recover. The truth poured out of her, a torrent of dates, names, and clandestine meetings held in the dead of night. She spoke of the grain hoarded while the western villages starved and the gold diverted from the borders to line the pockets of the men now trembling before her. Every word was a strike against the foundations of their deceit. For 3 years, she had been a ghost in her own home, a silent witness to the rot. But as she laid bare a conspiracy to sell the crown to the northern invaders, she was the most powerful person in the room. By the time she finished, the court was in an uproar, but Isolde felt a strange, chilling peace. The vow had been a cage, but it had also been a crucible, tempering the truth until it was sharp enough to cut through steel. She stood amidst the chaos, her lungs burning, the silence finally and irrevocably shattered. The kingdom was saved, not by the sword, but by the simple, devastating weight of the first word. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It is crazy and more intriguing as you can ever image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.